we're live on the internet. Thank you so much for joining us. This is YouTube, as you probably already know, since you're the one looking at it. And I am your host, Brett Fisher, for somewhere between 30 and 60, maybe even 90 minutes of talking about all things containers and DevOps. And this week I've got a special guest, but before we get to all the fun, let me just clear you up on what your responsibilities are here. So you're watching us live, and that means that your responsibility is to put questions in the chat. So this week it's all about Kubernetes conference in Europe, and there are multiple events from KubeCon around the year, and this one is not anywhere near me. And I thought it would be great to have someone from the show there live. So we're going to be talking about all things Kubernetes, service mesh, networking for container orchestration. I'm sure I'll throw in some questions and comments about Swarm because, you know, I like Swarm too. And so your job is to ask your questions on Kubernetes. Our job is to answer those questions, talk about what's going on in the community, and especially this week at KubeCon. And if you have not taken my courses before, I do stuff on the internet. I talk about Docker. I train people on Docker for a living now, and I've been talking about Docker forever. So anything containers is where my focus is at, and you can see that up here at the link. You can get coupons for my courses, which I now have 3, including the latest Docker Mastery for Node.js. So if you're interested at all in Node.js and you want to use it in containers, I consider it the only course that is focused on Node.js development and running production inside Docker containers. Over 8 hours of stuff just for you, in case you're a Node fan. Even if you're not a Node fan, there's actually still a whole lot of stuff to learn in there. But I thought I would focus it on one ecosystem. And of course, since then, everyone's been asking about Python and all sorts of other languages. So we will see. Stay tuned. If you have questions, like I said, put them in the chat. We'll be following those questions and promoting responding to them as we get through the show. So let me bring on our guest this week. And today with me is Lee Calcote. He is the founder of Layer 5 IO. He is about all things containers, service mesh. He's a Docker captain and a CNCF ambassador. And he spoke this week on service mesh and maybe other things at KubeCon. So welcome to the show, Lee.
Hola. The show is in Spain. That's about as much Spanish as I know, Brett. So we're gonna...
Is it in the same? It's in Barcelona, right?
It is in Barcelona. It is not in the same venue as the previous DockerCons, though. And so I've had to become friends with many different taxi drivers.
Right. Yeah. It's not a Uber city.
It's a my taxi. Actually, Phil Estes, our Docker captain friend. He was educating people just on how my taxi, the Uber variant, works here. So
the Uber-ish. Yeah, that's true. There's a lot of cities now, including Austin, right, where you, if you want to get a taxi, or an Uber-like experience, you need a different app. So, not everything has been taken over by one company, which is good. All right. So this week, what did you speak on at KubeCon?
A couple different things. I was fortunate enough to, have a few different sessions.
Cool.
Most of them very. So service mesh is been my focus. Actually, today's Thursday, between the time zones and the all the doings around KubeCon, it's a bit hard. So yesterday gave a presentation on service mesh and really on 2 of the questions that people always have about a service mesh, and maybe I'll wait to explain more in case I'm interrupting, but
no.
But yeah, so the 2 questions that I've gotten sick of not having a decent answer for have to do with which service mesh should I try and how. Second to that, it's how much overhead, what's the performance cost of running a service mesh? You're going to get some value, but you got to burn a couple of CPU cycles to get that value. How much is it going to cost me? So we've been working on an open source project called Meshery, for the last 4 months in coordination with a couple of PhD students in Austin, Texas, at the University of Austin. And we were presenting some results from some of those tests. So lots of folks interested in the cost of a mesh.
Yeah. And for those that are new to Kubernetes, and really just container orchestration, because service mesh is not exclusive to Kubernetes, but that seems to be where all the action's at right now. Well, why do I need? What is a service mesh, and why do I need it?
Yeah, great question. There are maybe 11-ish different service meshes out there. So you got some choice, first of all, which is fantastic and
Hard.
not so fantastic at the
Right.
same time. But what they are and why do you need one is they are a way of removing the blindfold in terms of getting some visibility as to where all of your microservices are, your containers, and where they're moving around and which container is talking to which container. Then they're a way of getting some granular control over the traffic between them, maybe not allowing certain requests or rate limiting others, redirecting traffic a different way. They are also a way of securing your cluster. So securing, providing MTLS between your containers and getting a lot of that mostly for free. You sort of deploy the service mesh, deploy your containers on the service mesh, and depending upon which one you've deployed and how you've tweaked it, you get those things that I was just describing. So you get a lot of control and visibility without changing code.
Right. Right. And this is all living outside of your app, right?
Yeah. So you get a fair bit of visibility about the traffic and the service requests that are coming into your containers and going out of your containers, but you also actually get distributed tracing, or a little bit of what folks might refer to as application performance monitoring, APM. So you get a little bit of white box info about what's being executed inside of your containers, how the health of your app, and how
Right.
fast it's responding or not. So
Yeah. So from the outside in, almost, right?
yeah.
Yeah, looking at that observability. And I know that you and I have talked in the past about observability. In case you haven't watched this show since the beginning, Lee and I actually were in Velocity Conference in London together, September 2018, so that last year, and we did a live show from there. I don't actually remember what we talked about, but you can, if you search YouTube for Brett and Lee Velocity Conference, you'll probably find that video. And at the time, I know that observability was a big thing for you. Basically, that's one of the things that all these layers of abstraction do for us is they come into play, and then suddenly we're not sure exactly how we now see to what our app is doing now that it's in a container, in an orchestrator. We don't even know what node it's running on. All those sort of new problems that we didn't have 6 years ago.
Yeah, it's amazing. Well, I guess what's amazing is that some of the existing tools, it just took them so long to update and to become container friendly.
Yeah.
And
I wonder sometimes if that was, well, obviously it's hard, right? Keeping your software updated as fast as the industry is moving is always hard. But I wondered sometimes if it was because traditional IT vendors, software vendors weren't convinced that maybe this isn't going to be a thing. Maybe it's going to be completely different in 2 years. And then at some point, like just all container things in general, I think they realized, well, if we wait to find out, we will not exist. Right?
Yeah, you
just got to try.
Same thing happens, I think, around open source for a lot of those vendors. They maybe haven't really spent the time to grok open source, and as such, some of those vendors get sideswiped.
Yeah.
I know, Brett. As a matter of fact, Brett, I know that you're quite savvy with Prometheus, and that's probably a good example of observability, of monitoring software in new age that has taken off.
Yeah, and it was a hobby project. It all started as hey, we did this thing at work, so check it out. And now it's was it the second project to graduate CNCF, the incubator, into an official sort of project? It's pretty cool.
Yeah. It from one way or the other. I don't.
Right. I think Kubernetes was the first, and then Containerd was maybe third. Not that I'm keeping track, but
Yeah.
um, so all right. So you talked about service mesh. What else did you do? Did you talk about? You said
Yeah.
you had did a couple things there. So
Yeah, a couple. Yeah, well, I sat on. I ended up talking about service mesh a lot, just at various venues. So there was a. This is kind of well. I sat on the New Stacks pancake breakfast. We talked. Got some.
nice.
Messy with some syrup and some service meshy things. VMware was hosting that one, and they've got some things to talk about. As those that run and maybe who doesn't have a VMware license. They have SDN and they purchased Nicira and they have NSX. So the service mesh and virtual networking is certainly an area of interest to VMware. I ended up getting an opportunity to speak at Cloud Native Rejects. So it was the inaugural event, a small event, but it's really predicated upon the notion that there are many, many people who submit to speak at DockerCon and many, many people that submit to speak at KubeCon, not all of whom, not all of those talks
Right.
can be accepted.
It would be a 2 week conference.
Yeah.
Yeah.
that would be a nerd fest to go down in history. But yeah, so the notion with Cloud Native Rejects is that if your talk was rejected at KubeCon, here's overflow seating, here's overflow presentation
Yeah.
for.
Is that the day before?
It was on Sunday. No, so I guess 2 days before, or it depends on how you want to count it, but
Yeah.
on Sunday and the day before on Monday, a lot of add-on events to KubeCon. So
Yeah.
lots of single day, single track events
Yeah.
on all the topics.
That's like workshops or
Workshops and as a matter of fact, I signed up for one. Oddly enough, it was a Linkerd workshop, and so Linkerd is one of those
Yep.
those service meshes. But yeah, on all the topics. So whether it was serverless things, AWS had it in ecosystem day, lots of things about EKS. And then, literally maybe 15 or more add-on days, add-on events.
Right. Yeah. So it's about 8,000 people, and I'm pretty sure the U.S. one is larger, right? I think last year it was over 10,000 or something. And then there's so much going on. There's so many people that want to talk about their thing that you have to have a conference before the conference, which I've never heard of. I love the idea of it. I've just never seen another conference where there was so many people that were like, we should get together and do our talk somewhere else that people will actually show up to see it before the conference.
I've heard I've seen smaller startups having their company meetings alongside a DockerCon or alongside a KubeCon because that's when they all got together.
Yeah.
And they were all. So
That's smart too. It saves you travel, and it gives everyone an ability to get to the conference because now that's a great idea. Well, my company of 3 is we would go to anywhere, and it would be a big deal. So maybe we'll do that next year at DockerCon Austin.
I guess I have to bring
yes,
whiskey with me.
yes, but yeah. There's no hard problems with bringing a 50-pound dog on a plane, right? That's fine. I just put her in my lap. So you're in Austin. You also have a local meetup you run for Cloud Native, right?
Yeah.
And a Docker meetup, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I'm a bit remiss on the consistency of a month-to-month, monthly meeting. But I tell you what, Austin has just had a major influx of techies. So I consider myself fortunate to be able to nerd out as and when needed.
Yeah, and that's a tough thing. I mean, when you're so busy doing all the other stuff to also get presenters, organize all the logistics. I talked about a couple weeks ago that after DockerCon, because they highlight the community leaders and they put them on stage and give them awards, and I think that's fantastic because the community leaders are like the unsung heroes of open source because a lot of us, it's one thing to read something on the internet. It's another thing to go and hang out with people and talk about it. And a lot of us can't afford to go to conferences, or there's not one near us. And those meetups are often the only way we get to actually hang out, learn from others, talk over tacos and beer. And it's a really important part and often those organizers go, no one even knows who they are. Like, you just go to the event and you don't realize there's 3 or 4 people or if you're lucky, 3 or 4 people, those of us that are just one person that have to do all the things. So if you're near Austin, check out the Cloud Native Austin. And if you live in Austin and you're interested in this stuff at all, help a guy out.
Yeah. Please.
Raise your hand and say, "I'd love to talk on this. Can you just schedule a date and I'll talk?" Like, that's the thing I love the best. At least for me, it's not as hard to get sponsors for food and meeting space. It's getting people to talk, and everyone doesn't think their story is valid, but that's totally not true. Like, if you're doing this stuff, even as a hobby, often it's valuable to someone, to a group of people, and it's worth talking about. So. And that's how I got my start, by the way. People ask, like, how do you get on stage at DockerCon? Like, you had 800 people or whatever in your room today or yesterday when you did your service mesh. I think it was yesterday. It looked packed. In fact, there's a picture on Twitter, on your Twitter profile, of a packed room wall to wall. And, obviously impressive topics, lots of people there. But, the way that I got to that level was starting at meetups, like talking at local meetups and doing that over and over again for a decade, probably for at least 6 years before I ever talked at a conference. I don't know about you, but.
Yeah, quite a similar story. And interestingly, I think, a couple of things that you touched on are really important, I think, to stress, and that is the oftentimes thankless job of being a meetup organizer, but just how really important that is. Meetups, those technology meetups can be nearly the only outlet that some of us have to getting our inner geeks fed and to getting to socialize and learn from others. It's a very forgiving environment to go and share. I think through sharing what you learn as you share. Others are, in fact, very thankful of it. The meetups are such a good public service. Moreover, to your point, an excellent place to sharpen those presentation skills and to build the confidence and to get over the imposter syndrome of nobody knows it all. And thank goodness that there are some of those brave enough to stand up in front of a podium and share something.
Yeah, and it's people, I think, really underestimate what it takes to just stand up in front of sometimes just 15 people and talk for 10 minutes uninterrupted. That for a lot of people that can be very hard to do. But yeah, meetups, I think, are the way to get started. Most of them are, there's a few in my local area out of the dozen or so that I have that are like the Node.js or JavaScript meetup. You got to get on a schedule for like 6 months. But the rest of them, they're all happy to have content, even if it's just a little bit related to their audience. And sometimes I know, like the .NET meetups locally, they will just have random topics sometimes to get people out of their shell, like to get them out of their little world of .NET. They'll just throw in, like, here's a Go language. Someone's coming in and just talking about a different language that would be still interesting to people that do .NET for a living. So yeah, very cool. So back to Docker or KubeCon, because now that I've said DockerCon, it's gonna haunt me. Back to KubeCon. We're gonna. By the way, if you're just joining us, we're gonna get to some questions here in a few minutes. But I wanted to seed the questions a little bit as well, and ask Lee, when you're getting started with Kubernetes. So people that are learning Kubernetes and starting it, they don't get service mesh out of the box, right? That's not a built-in feature.
Not of the vanilla Kubernetes today. So if you went to, there's many places to get Kubernetes. If you got vanilla Kubernetes, a service mesh wouldn't be included. There are, I think there are near 80 something certified Kubernetes distributions.
Wow.
Which are more opinionated. Yeah. And some of those, at least, I'm not sure how many of them, but more than one of them do package in one of those service meshes, so that when
Yeah, 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 and that's a good point. This is like I'm trying to think of a good analogy. I don't know if you have one for how there's upstream Kubernetes, and I think a lot of us we tend to learn the open source parts first, and then there is the packaged solutions that are often needed in corporate environments that you wouldn't necessarily build everything from scratch. Like most of us don't build our own Linux kernels. Some do, and that's fine. But like it's like the 80-20 rule. 80% of us probably don't need to build our own Linux kernel, so we just run a standard Linux distribution, similar to Kubernetes, where there's the upstream open source stuff on GitHub, and you can learn that. And then your choices at the office, you probably, unless you have a 3, 4, 5 people on your team to do this work, you're probably going to want a distribution, right? What are your thoughts on that?
That last bit cut out, but
Oh,
I'm pretty sure I got the question, which is my perspective is pretty positive in that there's certainly some environments where the only way to procure software or to use software is to purchase it. And so now I've got myself staring at the delayed YouTube live
no,
interface.
you're fine. You're fine. And well, it's about like and when we talk about distributions, because I think we mentioned this a couple weeks ago in the show, is we weren't even sure whether to call these things distributions. I just started calling them that because I didn't know what else to use, and I didn't know if we'd even come to that industry standard term of when you buy Docker Enterprise, you get a distribution of Kubernetes. You might look at AWS's Kubernetes tools that they provide you as a distribution or their way of running Kubernetes. DigitalOcean just launched their own they announced this week the general availability of their Kubernetes platform, and that I guess I would say that is a cloud-based distribution. And all of these have different pieces to the puzzle. They all have the basic vanilla Kubernetes upstream, right? So they have this orchestrator and scheduler and these little agents that run on the nodes, and they have that basic fundamental underneath. But how the networking works, whether or not you have service mesh, what kind of security controls, whether you have role-based authentication, all your metrics, your logging, all those things are sort of add-ons, right? Is that how you understand it?
Yeah, no, yeah, totally. The first example that pops to mind is Rio from Rancher, a Kubernetes distribution that does have a service mesh built in. As an example, yeah, I think if you were to go back a little further in history, and I guess I'd be really curious about the viewers if anyone has done a tour in OpenStack land. That when we talk about distributions, my mind goes there as maybe the first or one of the first example that pops to mind about distributions. OpenStack as a project was sprawling and had many different individual projects within OpenStack, so Nova and Heat and like just a litany of projects. And so after a while, it was kind of a question of like, well, what is OpenStack? And
Right.
it really was through, I think, the help of vendors creating opinionated distributions that people felt comfortable that they would get support, that it was packaged and it was kind of consistent in its delivery, that there can be a lot of value behind a distribution.
Yep.
And some people argue, against them, but I think there's a place for them and a place not for them, and it depends. Just a bunch of it depends.
It's the consulting answer, right? I
Yeah.
mean, I think a lot of people want. For the longest time, we had one offering, and that was you run Docker, right? That was at the early days of container land. That was really it for a long time, and so it was an easy answer for everyone because we were all learning the same thing. We were all talking about the same thing. But as Docker grew, then we got different container runtimes, and now we have different orchestrators. And now, even inside of one orchestrator ecosystem, we have all these projects. Now, if we look forward 10 years, a lot of these projects won't exist, or they'll be merged in the existing projects. Some of these distributions are going to have to go away. I don't think an industry can sustain itself necessarily with 80 different distributions. At least unless a lot of those get very niche, right? Like we are the telecom distribution, or we are the IoT only on Raspberry Pi distribution, or whatever. And yeah, you could sort of segment that way. But I think for the more general, like I think of Docker Enterprise, I think of Rancher, VMware has theirs, OpenShift. Like we've got these major beginner players that are sort of, I don't know, taking up 80% of the oxygen in the room when it comes to distributions. But in terms of learning, my advice, and let me know if you agree with this, has been like learn the upstream at least to understand what the basic fundamentals are, and then based on what your company is going to likely do or what you think you're going to need in your job, you might want to pick a distribution to learn for that. And if you're a Red Hat shop where everything is Red Hat Enterprise Linux, you're probably going to stick with their brand of Kubernetes, OpenShift, and you probably wouldn't want to go bother with a Docker Certified Administrator cert and learn Docker Enterprise if they're never going to use that distribution.
I agree. For me personally, even if I don't leverage it any other way than just making me feel comfortable with understanding the delineation between what you get out of the open source version and what you get out of the the vendor distribution. That's just it's nice for me as a consumer to say, okay, there's the value add there. Yeah. And sometimes the value add is it's just support. It's just for in Rancher's case, it's all open source. It's put together. They put effort and blood and sweat and tears behind packaging it up for you. And if you like that package,
yep,
it's free to use. But if you need help, or again, I agree in terms of it being a good way to learn it. You mentioned something I wanted to touch on a second ago. It was I think you talked about having multiple container runtimes, multiple container orchestrators, and we brought forth, I think, not only do those enjoy different levels of adoption, but as this new cloud native landscape has unfolded, we've, as a community and as an industry, brought forth new standard interfaces. And maybe I should use the word standard not as an internet standard, but rather as a commonly agreed upon API specification. One of those was the CRI, the Container Runtime Interface, behind which you could run different container runtimes, the same thing was true for Container Network Interface, CNI, Container Storage Interface, CSI. And the reason I bring this up, Brett, is because, it's kind of interesting to understand the motivations and why those things come about. But was that this week at KubeCon on Tuesday, Microsoft unveiled an early specification, but it's called SMI. It's Service Mesh Interface, and it's of the same intentions and goals around, as you would see for CSI, CNI, CRI. But it's for Service Mesh as a commons API specification behind which maybe you would run any of the 11 service meshes that I was talking about before.
Very cool. SMI. Yeah, and these are all different ways for us to allow a bunch of different products to all work together seamlessly in the end. Yeah. That's great. There was so many announcements this week that my Twitter feed I couldn't handle it. I failed to keep my Twitter up to date on all the different topics and all the different announcements, because we had the DigitalOcean, we had the Rio, I'm sure countless other things that I'm forgetting. So let's get to some questions while you're here. It's it's in the evening over in Spain, so I don't want to keep you all night. But next time we'll have to have beers while we do this, because that'll make it more fun.
You won't have to twist my arm.
And I'm going to post the first question in here. If I'm a Docker user but not much of a K8s, would it make sense to go to the KubeCon conference in San Diego in November?
Oh boy, it's one of those consultant answers.
Yeah.
Well, hey, I mean, if I get to answer, I would say, I'd say certainly. I'd say I'd say hit up DockerCon first if you can. If you're able to hit up KubeCon after that, do it in so much as there's a decent set of additional tools that you may very well find that you're going to need in your environment, and there's a pretty well curated collection of those tools as CNCF projects, and that KubeCon, it's called KubeCon. It's actually KubeCon plus Cloud Native Con. So it's really, Kubernetes is kind of the flagship product or project. But there are 37 other CNCF projects and counting that you can learn about at KubeCon. So I think I think it's worth coming out to Spain for.
Yeah, yeah. I would say the same thing. Like for any vendor conference, not vendor conference, but ecosystem conference like this, it's going to be overwhelming no matter what you do. So I wouldn't be intimidated by it, but I think you would definitely get more out of it if you at least had played a little bit with Kubernetes and maybe taken some basic information online. Because you're going to walk into the keynote on day one and it's not going to make a whole lot of sense if you're not even sure what Kubernetes the project is. So I definitely think there would be some basic understanding that you'd want to have, but you certainly do not need to be running it in production or like having any sort of advanced knowledge, right? So
Yeah. Brett, maybe I'll offer up a couple of thoughts there, just as someone who might be coming to Kubernetes, just looking at coming to Kubernetes. Maybe I'm sure you've talked about this on other podcasts, but just a super quick way to get to Kubernetes being with Docker and just, checking off deploy Kubernetes on a Docker desktop rather.
Yeah, that's you're talking about just having it locally with Docker desktop.
Yeah, just as a super quick way to play with Kubernetes and begin to grok it.
Yeah, I think Docker, if you can use Docker desktop, it's definitely the easiest way to run Kubernetes locally because you don't have to learn a tool like Minikube or Mini-K8s or any of those tools or MicroK8s, I think is what it is. Because you're already going to have to learn the kubectl or what was it now? The official is kubecontrol, right? kubecontrol.
All right. Okay. All right. Good. I thought I was going to have to say something, but okay.
Right. Well, I was like you. I mean, I was like, kubectl is the thing that made it roll off the tongue easiest, but we don't always get what we want. So the official, if those of you who are not aware, there's at least a dozen ways to say the actual command line tool, and there was even via the founders and maintainers of Kubernetes, they could not agree on the pronunciation. So someone then got into the README of the 1.9 release, I think it was, so a year ago or something, basically, and that it's now considered the canonical pronunciation is kubecontrol, right? So.
Yeah, good. Yeah, we like to, which I guess that means people just don't like to give hugs to their infrastructure. I'm not sure. There's no more loving and petting of the infrastructure. It's more cattle.
I always thought of cuttlefish, not cuddle, as in like, which neither one makes any sense. But hug your cube. That's a great, hug your. And then there was is it cube or cube? Yeah, it doesn't. I don't know. None of it makes sense. Everyone's got an argument for their own thing. It doesn't really matter. But we actually made it. We actually just had this discussion yesterday because we're making a Kubernetes course, and I was like, okay, I'm going to have to say up front that we're going to be calling it kubecontrol, and I'm going to have to reference why, because I'm going to get a bunch of people when they start watching the videos, and they're going to say, you're not saying it right, because they watched a video from a year ago that pronounced it different. So anyway. All right, so let's do some more questions. Biker 2010, who is another a student of Docker Mastery and who was at DockerCon this year, and we got to high five and meet up, take a selfie. He has a question on, he says he's a devout Swarm user, but have a new project that needs dynamically expanding, shrinkable, either a number of sizes host, wildly varying traffic load. It seems K8s might be a better solution. Thoughts? You got any thoughts on that?
I do. And so before I embark on answering this, I would say, Brett, you know Swarm better than I do. And so, dismiss this correct this if this is to my knowledge, is Kubernetes is more capable in this regard of, there's a couple of different ways in which perhaps it is. There's such a thing as horizontal pod auto scaling. There's also which is to say, if for a given set of workloads or a given set of containers, so pods, that you need additional replicas of those, that Kubernetes facilitates for the scaling out of those and the shrinking of those. Kubernetes also facilitates for the scaling, well, certainly for the scaling out. I'm not quite as clear about the shrinking back of
Always harder.
Nodes within a cluster.
Yeah, yeah. I was going to say shrinking is always harder than growing in infrastructure.
And so so I think, but if if you want to correct any of that with respect to Swarm.
Yeah, I mean, well, Swarm doesn't have it out of the box, and I don't think they're ever going to. In fact, I think at DockerCon, the lead Drew, the lead developer on the Swarm Kit repo, said that I think he was talking about auto scaling, where his answer was there's add-ons, and there's multiple ways that you can add on tools that will look at metrics. And the core problem for Swarm, unlike Kubernetes, is Swarm doesn't gather metrics over time. So it can never really make a decision based on 5 minutes of CPU or anything, because it really it dumps real-time metrics so that you can capture those with Prometheus, but it's not going to store them itself. Because if you think about it, that one of the best and worst decisions of Swarm is that it is in the Docker daemon. It is the engine itself. So we started adding all that stuff to the engine, and then now you got this huge bloat and potential risk of your engine failing, where with like Kubernetes, all this stuff is external, right? It's actually containers running on top of the engine. So you can add as much or a little as you want there, and you're not really adding fundamental risk to your container app per se, because that monitoring or that data tracking system can sort of go down and you won't really matter. So I look at it as like two different opinions on how to run containers. I think that either way you can do auto scaling. It's just with Kubernetes, it's definitely more built out of the box and implied with the default feature set. With Swarm, you're going to either have to use the something that the cloud already provides, like auto scaling groups in AWS, which can easily do Swarm up and down auto scaling of physical nodes. But the point I want to make is that for those of you that are not auto scaling, we actually talked about this at DockerCon on the live show, which unfortunately I didn't get Lee on that show, but I should have. We had two other Docker captains there, and someone asked about auto scaling, and we ranted on it for about 5 minutes. And basically, the summary of that story was: if you don't need to auto scale, and if you can get away with not auto scaling, don't, because it is not always as easy of a problem as you think it is. Even just because there's a little tool that will do it, doesn't mean that it's going to be easy for you to implement. And it's very context sensitive to your applications, your environment, your situation. And scaling down is always harder than scaling up. Imagine you've got clients connecting and talking to you, and you're supposed to stop that stuff. Like, that requires lots of expertise in scaling down and understanding sending FIN packets and TCP and all sorts of little nuances of networking and client connections and stuff, regardless of what tool you use. So I would say if you can get away without auto scaling, great. Don't do it. Biker sounds like he needs to have it. He has to varies widely in traffic loads. So for him, it's definitely going to end up being a requirement. And I think not if you already have all the expertise of Swarm, maybe trying to figure out how to use Prometheus on top of Swarm to just look at the Docker API and make calls back to the Docker API using existing examples on the internet. That might be the easiest way to go. There's something called Orbiter that's also a third-party tool. It's not current. It does work, but it's not completely current. I don't think it works well with stacks. So Orbiter is a tool I know that does auto scaling. And for those of you that have never done auto scaling, in orchestration, unfortunately, we have two levels of auto scaling. We have the infrastructure, the nodes themselves, and then the number of replicas in your deployments or services, and depending on which orchestrator you're using. And I think that a lot of people underestimate that complexity up front, and they just think they need to scale their nodes. But really, doing that is most often going to do nothing for you, because that workload isn't going to hop across nodes suddenly just because you gave it a new server. Then you've got to do other things in each orchestrator to make sure that you're adding more containers on top of those nodes. So anyway, we could have a whole show on auto scaling, and we'll maybe have Lee back for that.
Yeah, there's a
It's a good question.
Yeah, to your point, Brett, about the complexity of eviction of currently running contain. Boy, I can't help but look over at the delayed live YouTube stream to just throw me totally off on what's going on. But
It's tempting you.
but yeah, no, complex. Actually, you think about it, whether you were turning down nodes in your cluster, whether you were shrinking your cluster, or whether you were just shrinking the number of pods the number of replicas that you're running for a given set of pods, that you've still got kind of that same issue that you were just describing around existing connections coming in and trying to gracefully redirect those to either a different node in the case of cluster autoscaling, or a different pod in the case of like pod autoscaling. And it's some of I'm going to keep on bringing this back to service mesh, I guess, but that's some of the use cases for a service mesh. And it strikes me actually that I offered up unsolicited suggestion around an easy way to get to Kubernetes as being Docker desktop, literally using a mouse click to turn on Kubernetes, on your well, in my case, my MacBook. The open source project I was talking about earlier called Meshery, it's arguably the easiest way to deploy a service mesh. It actually has adapters for 5 service meshes and counting. And so it's intended to let you quickly deploy a service mesh, play with it, and then actually it's intended to let you benchmark it. So I had to call it back out.
Yeah, very cool.
I'm
looking
yeah, now that we beat up Biker 2010's question.
Well, and he's got we talked for a while at DockerCon, and he's doing real world DevOps stuff, right? Like he's got complex requirements. Like no one tool solves every problem, and so this is the hard part, right? This is where like the rubber hits the road kind of thing, where do you try to augment your existing tool to do the additional functionality you need, or do you completely replace that with a new tool and have to learn that tool just to get that feature set out of the box? Like that is so unique to the environment, the company, the politics. Like we mentioned earlier, sometimes Kubernetes is simply a checkbox, and the fact that you told your company, I deployed Kubernetes, that's like a great thing to them, and a CIO wants to tell everybody that he's now running Kubernetes, and that the same thing happened with VMware, and like every other major technology shift, we've had these sort of CIO checkbox or CTO checkbox tools, and that's a real thing. Not every IT decision is 100% rational based on requirements. Like sometimes we make emotional decisions as a part of that, and we like a company or a vendor or a tool, and we can't even explain why. We just like it better, So those are all valid reasons, and it's hard. It's hard to give you a black and white sort of statement of yes, go do this. Right?
Another thing I think that happens to a lot of us is that we find that we're ready for something. I'll take an example of a container orchestrator. We find that we're running a lot of containers, and gosh, we need some orchestration. I realize I just said gosh. We really need some orchestration, and if the off-the-shelf container orchestrators aren't ready for us at the time, if that tech isn't ready for you at the time, then you've got to roll your own. And if you've rolled your own, you've got some amount of investment into it. It's probably doing some things that are unique and specific to your environment. And so getting off of getting rid of that, whether you consider it tech debt or not, things that you've deployed have a certain gravity to them.
Yeah, for sure. Especially, I think a lot of times we underestimate how much work we've already put into our existing solutions. And that's not just in code, because we always talk about like, rewriting something is often not the fastest way to success, and because a lot of us are like, well, this thing is no longer cool, so let's rewrite this old legacy app, and that always takes longer than we always expect. But also in infrastructure too, you forget about all the work you had to do to get that swarm set up, and all the add-ons, and all the containers, and all the services, and the YAML. And if you're used to that workflow, if the developers are used to using that, replacing that or adding a second orchestrator can add a lot of work. So if it was me, knowing how simple Swarm is, I would try to get auto scaling worked in Swarm today, and then just continue in your own learning with Kubernetes. I think all of us in the DevOps landscape need to know at least 2 tools for any one solution. Otherwise, that tool always looks like the hammer to hit every nail. If you only know Swarm, then the only orchestrator you know to solve a problem is Swarm, and you won't know ECS or Kubernetes or anything like that. So, yeah, cool. We've got another question also from Roscoe. It's not quite related to this, but he's asking from a question that was not able to get answered, I think, last week. Sorry, Roscoe. It was about how do you ensure that, basically you're asking how do you ensure certain things are started in a Swarm or really any orchestrator before other things are started. And I think the hard answer to your question is there is no push button way to do that. You essentially need to have tools and systems that will ensure that things that are started first are started, and that your apps do retries. So I think in his case, he's saying he has a private registry, and he has to ensure that it's started before other stack services are started. And there is no... Swarm doesn't have a capability for you to have services automatically wait on other services. That's not a thing. So you're going to either have to put something in your application startups that ping an endpoint, and you might Google for wait for it scripts. That's wait for it, like with the dashes. There are a few examples of that stuff out there. I'm not a huge fan of them because I don't really think they've solved the full problem. They just sort of solve the temporary starting up of your containers, because if the registry goes down, what happens when your apps, are needing the registry then? Like, what do they do then? Do they just crash? So there's the starting of apps, there's the replacing of apps, there's the updating of apps, there's this whole life cycle. And if you only put in a script for starting up, you're not really solving the full problem. But in your case, I would say you're going to need to figure out a way to have that thing fully up. Now, you can use health checks to ensure that things are live, and I recommend that you put in the registry a health check. You always have on every one of your services. I don't care what orchestrator you're using, always have health checks on everything you're doing, because that's the only way the orchestrator or the container engine is going to know if your app is up or not, and whether or not to send it traffic. So do that first, but that's not going to prevent you from starting other applications in a orchestrator and then that first one doing it. I do believe Kubernetes has a little more intelligence on their end on that, right?
Yes, they do. Not only does Kubernetes have health checks, as you described, which health checks being good, although not necessarily being the mechanism by which you can prevent your other containers, where you can tightly control the sequence by which your containers boot and the applications inside them start to run. So Kubernetes also has the
readiness.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm with you.
Readiness checks, which can help for you to sort of orchestrate, if you will, the sequence by which you're.
Yeah, and that's all about readiness checks. I think are all about the whether or not traffic is sent to that container, and so it allows you to sort of like take the container out of the pool of load balancing connections, but that's still not going to prevent a container, because this is a common question people have is I want my app to start after the database is ready. So this question for Roscoe is very similar. I have an image, a registry that needs to be started before I do other things. How can I ensure it's ready? And that's not yet, in my mind, there's not really a solution out of the box with orchestrators to control startup and shutdown of certain containers by the availability of other containers. You might argue that pods solve a few of those problems by putting everything in a pod, but I don't think that's what you're trying to do here. And you're on Swarm, so you don't get pods. Like there's a lot to it. So if Roscoe, you're still watching, I'm going to discuss this inside because he's a Docker Mastery student that is asking that question in Docker Mastery, the Q&A for that course. So I will hit you up later today on that question, and we'll have a better discussion, I think, in the Q&A because it gets a little more complex in that sense. So I think, let's see, any more questions before we wrap this up? If you want to get your last minute questions, throw them in the chat. We'll take one or two more questions at the very end. But for Lee, where can people find you on the internet?
There's a Twitter handle. It's L Calcote is maybe a good place. The other place where I've been, maybe there's two places. One, every time I give a talk, for those who didn't suffer enough during my talk, they can find all the slides at calcotestudios.com, and the recordings and the slides and things are there. Recently I've been, obviously I can't help but talk about Smash every other 5 minutes, and so just been establishing a community and a repository of information, and even the workshops that I gave at DockerCon and KubeCon and Velocity on Service Mesh. They're all freely available at layer5.io. So those are all places you can reach out, and I will certainly bite you.
Yeah, layer5.io. Definitely check that out. That's Lee growing a community of people all talking about networking, service mesh, and those higher level abstractions that we now deal with. And for those of you that are looking to learn about service mesh, would Layer 5 be a good place for them to start if they just want to learn about what it is? And
there's two resources that in my very unbiased opinion are fantastic. There's a free O'Reilly book that's a great introduction to service meshes that really speaks to to your question earlier about what is a service mesh and why do I need it. The thing for me, something that I understand really helps me learn much more easily is when you compare the new thing to something that you already know, and that's what that book does, and sort of explains service mesh in context of things like a container orchestrator. Because Brett, we just got done talking about application health checks and readiness checks and things, and we talked about like auto scaling of pods, like redirection of existing connections and those. Well, there's other technology that does some of those things, and service mesh does some of those. And so why would you use a mesh if the other thing? And so that free ebook, I'm sorry, it's not an ebook. That free O'Reilly book explains it. Also, the workshops that are there are, so there are workshops on Istio. Istio is a popular and prominent service mesh. It's the most powerful. It is also the hardest to understand and the hardest to deploy. So not that I would deter anyone from deploying it, but to use that tool Meshery, which is also on the site, that tool will deploy any of the, so.
Oh, it'll deploy them?
Yeah, it'll deploy Istio, it'll deploy Linkerd, Console, soon Network Service Mesh, which is another CNCF project. It'll also deploy Octarine, which is it'll do it.
Yeah, very cool. I didn't actually know that it did that. That's a really neat thing. I'm gonna have to definitely check it out. You told me to check it out. I didn't check it out. It's my fault.
And look, I as the admiral of the Docker captains, I can only salute you. So many times.
Well, I don't know if I'm still the admiral. I was given an award last year, but they keep giving them out. So we're gonna have an admirals club, I think, is what we're gonna have. So well, thank you so much for jumping on the call from KubeCon in Barcelona, and we will be seeing each other probably again sometime soon at another conference. Who knows when? But it's great to see you and talk about service mesh and Kubernetes and the growth of this ecosystem. It's it's crazy every year to look back at what we've done in 5 years and how much everybody's gotten on board the bandwagon of trying to make it basically easier and faster for us to deploy software, like just figuring that thing out one layer at a time and adding tools on top of it. Of course, if you're new to all of this, if you're new to containers, check out my site at brettfisher.com/Docker, and you'll see there a list of courses. What's missing from that is a Kubernetes course, but we are working hard on that every week, and you'll see announcements about that later this year. We're hoping that it won't be just your average learning the 101s of Kubernetes, that it'll actually be fun and it'll be more interesting than what you've seen before. So we'll see. Jury's out. I might suck. But thank you so much for watching us on YouTube Live. We will be back here next week on Thursday as usual. And let me know in the chat or in the comments if you want Lee back on the show, because I know he'd probably love to volunteer his time again, and we'd love to have him. So let's hear it if you want. What you want to talk about next time, and how much you love him being on the show, because it's great to talk to people out there making a difference. I mean, he's like a trifecta of the Docker Captain, CNCF Ambassador, and Layer 5, all things service mesh. He's got the whole thing. He's awesome. So thanks again, Lee. What's that?
Yeah. I show no favoritism.
Right.
I will pit myself out to my inner geek will just has
That's right. That's right. You're equal opportunity ambassador to all programs.
Yeah.
You come up with a title, he'll take it. He'll take it. Well, thanks again, and we will see you next week on YouTube Live. All right.